Hello, welcome to the second session in our series Thinking Christianly About the Virus. In this one I want to think about divine purpose in pestilence. Having agreed for centuries that the world had a beginning, it's only recently, in the last half century or so, that science and religion have begun to agree that the world will also have an end. And while the Bible has various pictures and images to talk about the end of the world, science has statistics and data to suggest that it is going to happen. The agreement seems to be that it has to do with an abuse of nature. Well, if we're thinking about plagues, there isn't really anywhere better to go in the Bible than Exodus and the story of God's people being liberated from the land of Egypt, where they had been slaves for a long time. Do you remember what happened? There were lots of plagues, and with each plague, Pharaoh's mind was changed a little bit, and then it was hardened again. But God constantly says this: the people were assured the Lord will make a distinction. Exodus chapter 9 verse 4. And when the hail came to destroy the crops, the hail struck down everything. Only in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites were, there was no hail. Exodus 9 again. And of the death of the firstborn of the Egyptians, we're told, not a dog shall growl at any of the Israelites, so that you may know that the Lord makes a distinction. And the narrator goes to great lengths to demonstrate the purposefulness of God's actions. It isn't simply about vengeance, of course. The result of God's action is liberation from political and economic exploitation. Similarly, the prophet Isaiah, in Isaiah chapter 2 verses 12 to 17, says this, and I'm reading from the inclusive version of the Bible. Yahweh Omnipotent has a day set aside against the proud and the lofty, against all that is exalted, and they will be humbled, against all the cedars of Lebanon, tall and lofty, and all the oaks of Bashan, against all the high mountains and all the steep hills, against every lofty tower and every fortified wall, against every ship of Tarshish and every stately vessel. Then arrogance of humankind will be brought low, and their smugness humiliated, and their idols will be utterly destroyed. People will hide in caves in the cliffs and in holes in the ground, hiding from the terror of Yahweh, from the brilliance of God's majesty. On that day the peoples will throw to the rodents and the bats their idols of silver and gold, which they made for worship. Now the allusions in that passage obviously are to commercial and military matters. Yahweh will mobilize forces against the commercial and military establishment, says Walter Brueggemann in his book The Virus as a Summons to Faith. What is God moving against specifically? Two things, I think: accumulation of wealth and accumulation of power. The outcome of God's action, of the pestilence, the plague, in this case, is justice. Finally, God acts in order to show human beings our own frailty and God's holiness. We can't avoid thinking about Job in these contexts, can we? And if you remember in the book, Job and his friends carry on and on for about 35 chapters, complaining about how Job didn't deserve what happened to him, and how unfair life and God are. And finally, God answers with a divine equivalent of, who do you think you are? Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Note the reference to the natural order again. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding. Who determined the earth's measurements? Surely you know. or who stretched the line upon it. Job realizes who he, as God, probes and questions. Job realizes who he is, as God probes and questions. In the end, Job says, "See, I am of small account." That's good for Job. Many writers and thinkers, perhaps most famously Richard Rohr, point out that the path to wisdom lies in acknowledging our own lack of significance. The outcome now is restoration, a restoration of right relationship with God that knows personal frailty and acknowledges God's greatness in worship. So liberation, justice, and restoration might proceed from God's activity in pestilence, plague, and power. Here's another thing on which Christian faith and science increasingly agree. Enlightenment thinking, positive rationalism, will not get us to the place from which the world now needs to think and act. We have to accept mystery, the idea that we don't know everything. As Einstein said, science without religion is lame, religion without science is blind. The beginning of wisdom, according to Proverbs 9 verse 10, is the fear of the Lord. It could be that the purpose of our current pestilence is to bring liberation, justice, and restoration to the peoples of the earth and to the earth itself.